In this video, we're going to take a look at how to add Duo's multi-factor authentication to Cisco ISE or Firepower Remote Access VPNs, where Cisco ISE is also integrated within the network as well. So typically, when we look at this particular deployment, we would have, in this instance, a Firepower threat defense device or secure firewall that is communicating with Cisco ISE via radius. And the authentication would take place when a user connects using their Cisco AnyConnect client to the VPN, and the authentication completes and authenticates that user. Now, what we're going to do in this particular demonstration is we're going to actually put Duo in that workflow so that the user is then prompted for two-factor authentication when they have successfully entered their username and password. The documentation I'm showing here is the Duo documentation that gives you a breakdown of this particular integration. Now, I am going to say off the bat that this is not my preferred integration for customers that have Cisco ISE in place already, and the reason being is because you're not really going to get the use that you want out of Cisco ISE when you integrate Duo with this particular workflow, and I'll show you why as we go through the demonstration as well, so it's a lot more clear. So I would say do take a look at other integration methods. There is other ways of doing this. I have included on my YouTube channel and on my website networkwizkid.com a few different ways that we can achieve this and actually get more use out of Cisco ISE as opposed to doing it this way. But nevertheless, we're going to take a look at how we can achieve this using this particular setup that's documented here with Duo. And the reason I want to cover this is because when customers are initially setting this up, this is the documentation you're probably going to see and probably going to look at using as well. So I just want to make sure that we get this demo down so that you can see exactly what it's going to look like before you configure it in your environment, and some of the drawbacks or potentially benefits depending on your environment that you will get from doing this as well. So we already have our Firepower VPN, Remote Access VPN configured here, so you can see that we have an environment where we're actually already communicating for authentication and authorization to Cisco ISE for our VPN clients. So that's all well and good. We don't need to change anything in the workflow here, because essentially how it's going to look is, if we just go back to the diagram, so our user here is going to connect using the AnyConnect client, and in a setup that's already configured, you would then have your Firepower device communicate with Cisco ISE, and then Cisco ISE would then go through the authentication to complete that and authenticate that user there for Remote Access VPN connections. With the Duo aspect, we're going to keep all that in place, so it's nice and easy to set up for customers that have this sort of environment already set up. The only difference we're going to do now is, instead of Cisco ISE reaching out to your identity provider, say that's Active Directory, to validate those user credentials, we're then going to now add Duo, and therefore Cisco ISE is going to pass off that radius request to Duo. And to do that, we need what's called the Duo authentication proxy. That's a lightweight application installed within your environment that's going to communicate with your primary authentication provider, identity provider, and in this case we're going to be using Active Directory, and that's going to then be used to validate those primary credentials, and then once that's done, it's then going to be used to carry out or to issue that two-factor authentication request, which then the user will have to approve or reject before they can access or successfully connect to the VPN if it is a legitimate request. So as I say, the Firepower configuration is already set up, so we shouldn't need to change anything there. We need to, from a Duo standpoint, we need to log into our Duo administration panel, our admin panel, and we need to go to our applications. And then we need to click protect an application. And now if we just search ISE, you can see that we've got Cisco ISE Radius. And the documentation is there. It's going to take you to the documentation that we was just looking at the diagram on. We'll just click protect here. And what we're going to do is we're going to need some details here from the details section to these three fields essentially need to be added to our authentication proxy. The authentication proxy is already downloaded and installed in my environment, and I've already pre-configured that, as you can see here. So I'll just walk through some of the configuration steps that we will need. So we will need to add our Active Directory client. So that's going to be where we communicate for to the identity provider to validate those primary credentials for the user. We then need to add a Radius Server Auto section, and I'm not going to cover this in great detail because there is the Duo documentation out there, and I have covered it in previous videos. So if you are unsure of what the authentication proxy is, please do check out the Duo documentation. So once we get to the Radius Server Auto section, we need to populate these three fields from the details that we just got from the admin panel. So we've got the iKey, SKey, and API host. So if we just go back now to our admin panel, so we can see the iKey is our integration key, secret key is our SKey, and API host name is the API host name. So we'll copy the iKey or integration key, and we'll paste that into there. We also need the S key or secret key, and as it says here, don't write down or share it with anyone. This is a demo, so it's a little bit different here. So I'll put in that secret key there, and then lastly we'll add the API hostname, and then we'll just take a look at what some of these configs are. So essentially these three parameters here where we've added the details are going to allow us to communicate with our Duo instance and application that we're configuring on the Duo admin panel now. The Radius IP address is going to be the IP address of your ISE node or nodes if you have a distributed deployment. So if you do have more than one policy service node, then you will want to add more fields below this. So radius underscore IP underscore 1 and then 2 and then 3 and how many ever that you want to use there. Same with the secret. So we're using one here. So we're going to have one ISE node, and we also have one secret for that ISE node, and that's so that we can communicate with ISE from the Duo authentication proxy. Fail mode safe so that we can still authenticate if we have any issues. And then with the client, we're specifying our Active Directory or our AD client that we configured above so that we can validate those primary credentials as well. There's a few more fields that you can add if you choose to do so, if you're using different ports, etc. We'll leave that as it is for the purpose of this demo. So essentially what's going to happen is the FTD is going to communicate or continue to communicate with ISE if you already have that configured using Radius. And then ISE is then going to communicate using Radius to the authentication proxy. And that's going to allow us to validate those primary credentials and issue that two-factor authentication before a user can successfully authenticate. So if we now just go ahead and validate this. And that looks all good here, validation passed. So what we'll do is we'll save that configuration. And once we're done, we need to restart the service so that those changes take effect. So we'll quickly do that. So we can see that the authentication proxy is starting now. Okay, so that's good. So authentication proxy config is done now. We'll just return back to the Duo admin panel, because I always recommend when we create new applications to assign a specific application policy to every application you create. So let's just call this one ISE Duo FTD demo. And we'll just create that policy. We'll apply that to our application. So you can see now that we have an application policy, and we'll just go ahead and we'll save that. We don't need to, in fact, I'll change username normalization to simple to strip off any information that we don't need on the username. We just want the username. So we saved that. So that's the application created down the Duo admin panel. We have also configured the authentication proxy. So the last step now is to configure our identity services engine. So we have an ISE here, and if we just go to our policy sets, we have, our default policy set here as it would look in a usual environment where you've not really modified or touched the default policy set. And as you can see, just as an example, we can click into that. We've got authentication policies we can create and set. We've got authorization policies we can also create and set as well. Now, this is where things are going to change, and I mentioned at the start of the video why I don't prefer this method when we're integrating Duo with ISE, because we actually remove the ability to fully utilize ISE in a way that you would expect when actually configuring this. And this is why I actually prefer to use different workflows that I have documented on my website and YouTube channel as well. Nevertheless, we'll take a look. So just remember that we can click into the policy set. We can see, modify and use authentication and authorization policies, etc., etc. Now we need to first go to our network devices. And as you'd expect, you've got that communication with ISE and the FTD between one another. That's all good. So just double check that you have that there. If you've already got it set up, then you will likely have that. Now we need to go to external radius servers, and this is where we need to add that Duo authentication proxy that we have configured. So we'll just give a name here. We need to do underscore, and then we'll give it the IP address. So that's 101.114 in my case, and our secret needs to correlate with the secret that we have on the authentication proxy as well. If you're using different authentication ports, accounting ports, then make sure you do change that. And what we need to also do is we need to change the server timeout here to 60 seconds so that we don't receive multiple authentication requests or two-factor authentication requests. That is when you're going through the process. Want to allow enough time for us to be able to complete primary and secondary authentication. So once we're done there, we'll just submit that. We'll save that. And then what we'll do is we'll go across to radius server sequences, and then we'll add a new sequence here. So we'll just say Duo. Now what we'll do is we'll set external auth sequence. And then now you can see that we've got the Duo auth proxy that we just configured here. So we can actually specify that as an external radius server, as you can see here. We'll enable local accounting as well. Let's just save that. Okay, now that's done. So now let's go to our policy sets. And as I mentioned before, we need to, what we're essentially doing is we're saying to ISE, use another radius server to complete the radius request that ISE has received. So by doing so, we are passing off that radius request, and therefore ISE really has nothing to do with that radius request in terms of being able to control the authentication and authorization. And you're going to see this now. So we'll just use this default policy here, and what we'll do is we'll just click on this drop down menu for our allow protocols and server sequence. That's the one that we're focused on, and you can see here that we have a proxy sequence now, and that's the external authentication with the Duo proxy that we just configured. So as soon as we specify that and save that, now what you can see is when we click into the policy set, we don't have anything else we need to do, because essentially what it's doing, as I said, is the actual policy itself is being used to say, well, pass anything that is coming in to the Duo authentication proxy. Now, with this being the default policy set, you know, we're not creating specific conditions for that. So you would ideally want to create a separate policy set for this, but just for this demo, we're just going to use the default policy set there so that we pass everything off to our Duo authentication proxy to complete that two-factor authentication. So this is really where I say that where you have ISE in your environment and you want to still utilize ISE for remote access VPN connections, you're not really going to see any benefit from ISE by particularly setting it up in this sort of way if you are using Duo as well, because like I say, you're just passing off that radius request to the authentication proxy. So yes, the benefit is that you are, you know, enabling or adding that two-factor authentication, but if you're wanting to use particular policies within, you know, such as authentication policies within your policy set, or even authorization policies within ISE, you're not going to be able to do that using this particular workflow. So I always recommend to customers, if you want to see or get out of this particular integration where you add Duo but still also make use of authorization policies and authentication policies in ISE, then it's probably best that you look at a different workflow, as I call it. Nevertheless, so we've saved that now. So now we want to actually test this, and to do this, we'll just go to our Radius live log so we can see the Radius requests and information come through there. And what we'll do is we'll open our AnyConnect client and we'll connect now to our VPN. And you can see I've already got this set up here. And I've already received now my two-factor authentication request to my device. So I'm just going to approve that now. And now you can see, as soon as I've approved, now it's establishing that VPN. And we're going to connect to that VPN. And just like that there, you can see now that we are connected as well. So if we just minimize that and we refresh our ISE logs, what you can see here is you can see that we have a successful authentication here. You can also check the authentication proxy logs as well. So to do that, we just need to head over to the authentication proxy, and you need to go into your where your authentication proxy is installed. So that's usually in your program files. So if I've got this here, so if I just go across to it here and I expand that and I just scroll down now, let's just see here. Here we go. So you can see that we've received a new request, and this request has come from our ISE instance. We can see it's a login request for me, my username here, and you can see we're sending the request to our Active Directory server. that does its thing there, and we can see that we've got the pre-auth result, which is off, and then we can see further on down here we've got the Duo authentication returned allow success, logging you in, and then we get that access accept message there as well, and then we send that response, and we're all good, and then we're authenticated pretty much. So you can check that there, and then similarly, if we just go back to our Duo instance and we go to reports, you can also see now that we've got that request here that says that the user's been approved, my username. We can see the application as well. We're not going to focus on trust assessment today. We can see the access device, and we can see the authentication method, etc. as well. So that's how you would set up or configure Duo in an environment where Firepower or ISE is configured for Remote Access VPN communicating with Cisco ISE, and you want to add Duo into that environment as well for two-factor authentication.